So, right, anyway, so what I did find in the research was a huge amount of media coverage. This has been done to death by the press in many ways. But a lot of the data that is out there from agencies, and including the RSPCA, was very, very unreliable. And when you try and match that data with this data and this data with that data, and Kennel Club with Dogs Trust and Dogs Trust with RSPCA, then none of it matches up. So it's very, very difficult. There's no mention of dogs and gangs in any of the UK studies, but in American studies there's quite a lot, because they're really onto this now, and they're beginning to recognise that certain types of individuals, and gang-affiliated people in particular, will use dogs in a particular way. So I did find lots of empirical or visual evidence and reports from police, from vets, and tenants and park users. So all of that became very, very useful. So here's some examples of the media stories, all from South London Press, Evening Standard, The Guardian. Kind of London-centric a bit for me, I think, but and it's interesting because when you get into analysing the media and how they use the media, this type of thing is a very good example, where you have the innocence of a young person set against the savage nature of the beast, you know. So innocent 12-year-old girl picking flowers, you know. So it's that kind of thing, very interesting. Sorry, that's a very criminological perspective, but... And then, so what we then find is we find that there's a lot of new language to kind of describe this. Status dogs, dangerous dogs, devil dogs, weapon dogs, pit bull panic, trophy dogs, land sharks I came upon just the other day. Have you heard that one? Yeah, land sharks. Ghetto monsters, have you heard that one? Okay, you will do. So all that kind of language is out there. And then, of course, you know, what comes with it, various discussions about having to crack down on all these things, and, you know, this idea that the Dangerous Dogs Act will be revised, but still waiting on that. So, for some people, they think, well, has this created what they call a moral panic? Is this a lot of huff and puff generated in the media that isn't really reflected out in the streets? And a lot of people do genuinely think that. The conclusion I came to in my book was, no, I don't think it is a moral panic. I think it is a genuine, reasonable fear that people have that this is an issue for the public. It's an issue for public policy. And of course, the kind of dogs that I'm talking about really are the banned breeds and these ones here. And a huge amount of cross breeding and hybridization, absolutely huge. Because I don't know very much about dogs, I had to learn all of this. I had to get all kinds of books and learn about all the different breeds and all their breed characteristics and so on and so forth. So I found it very interesting, I have to say. So what do we know? Well, we know there's not really available statistics. The RSPCA talk about increased complaints and what they call impromptu roles. This is where young men set off their dogs against each other, but usually keeping them on the chain. And that's called an impromptu roll. Probably lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes maximum. They might bet on it, maybe, you know, I bet my dog can take your dog, that type of thing. But it can look very vicious, and it can be very vicious, especially if you're in the park with your kids. The RSPCA say that in 2009, 2/3 of all the calls they got were related to this type of thing. So in 2009, after the death of Shea Ogunyemi, the Metropolitan Police start to pay a lot of attention to this. Councillors' mailbags are beginning to fill up with stories of all this type of thing. And the Metropolitan Police decide to set up a status dogs unit. They also tell me that the number of dog seizures increased really quite dramatically. So in 2 or 3 years, it's gone from 40 to 719, and it's now over 1,000. And of course, the kennelling costs that go with that, because when the dogs are taken into custody, they have to be kennelled. and the kennelling costs in 2009 were 1.25 million. They're now 3, 4, even 5 million pounds for the Met Police alone. So enormous, enormous. The Met Police have 3 kennelling contracts, and each one is so big, each contract is so big, it has to be done through European Union procurement rules. So the evidence suggests a huge increase in dogs and in certain types of dogs. But all of this has an implication for public space, not just for families who are using parks, but for everybody. The London Tree Officers Association. Yes, there is such a thing. I'd never heard of it either. But they say that there's a massive increase in the level of dog attacks on trees. And there you can see the bark has been stripped from a tree, because one of the things that these young men will do with their dogs is they will set the dog onto the tree to rip the bark off, with the idea that it will strengthen and amplify the musculature around the jaws. Okay? They will also hang the dog from branches of the tree, or they will string a tyre over the tree and get the dog to hang from the tyre. Now, certain dogs, pit bull type dogs in particular, might be able to hang for 2, 3, 4, 5, even up to 6 hours from that one wheel, and they'll swing back and forth, and all of this will build up the neck muscles and the jaw muscles of the dog, so the dog will start to puff up and look bigger. One London borough, Islington, said that they had identified £100,000 worth of damage in their borough alone, and of course there are 33 London boroughs, so enormous. They've had to close parks and enclose certain family areas because families are now frightened. They don't want to sit in the park or go to that part of the park because they are worried. And in Lambeth, in 2009, they reported 3 dangerous dog attacks every day in that one London borough. So there was a sense that, you know, things are beginning to escalate quite out of control. This is 2-year-old Kieran Guess, who was attacked in Swindon in 2012 by a Staffordshire pit bull. Terrible shame for him. But of course there have been many, many other similar dog attacks. Dog attacks risen by 40%. That figure is now, I think, in the last year gone up to over 5,500. So I'm not saying that all the dog attacks have been by pit bull or by aggressive bull breed dogs, but certainly the level of dog attacks has gone up significantly. We've had the deaths of 8 children since 2005, and we have now had 17 deaths in total in this country, the last of which was Jade Anderson in March. So, what else do we have in the UK? Well, we have evidence of organised dog fighting, and there seems to be some relationship with Asian gangs in places like Leeds and Bradford, in the West Midlands, and in London, in places like Tower Hamlets that have got a high Asian ethnic composition. In 2006 in Birmingham, 26 Asian men were arrested for dog fighting in one location, and that location was a kitchen showroom in Handsworth. A local police officer had been walking past the kitchen showroom, heard the sound of dogs fighting, and he peered through the crack in the window, and the kitchen units in this kitchen showroom had all been moved into the centre to create a pit, and in the pit 2 dogs were fighting, and there were all these guys cheering and gambling. So he called for backup. The backup came, they raided the whole place, they arrested these guys, they were all sentenced to prison, and but when they came in they couldn't find the dogs. And these guys had heard the police coming, they'd taken the dogs and they pushed them into the false ceiling to try and, you know, what dogs? No dogs here, officer. But of course they could hear these dogs continuing to fight up there. So weird. So there's been a huge increase in reports of dog fighting, which in gangland speak is quite often called street jousting. It's incredible how young people make up, they romanticize this kind of thing. Kind of crazy. David Grant told me that in 1 month, in October 2009, he treated 22 dogs at Harmsworth Hospital for injuries to dog fights, some of them quite serious. 22 dogs in 1 month. Absolutely extraordinary. And he would tell me that the types of individuals who would bring their dogs in are very threatening, very, very aggressive. He told me the story of one young man who waited in the waiting room while David stitched up his dog that had been partially disemboweled through dog fighting. When the stitching had been completed, the guy burst in, scooped up his dog and marched out, refusing to pay. Yeah. And then about 3 weeks later, David got a call from the police to say that there had been a serious incident in a tower block in North London. So David goes with the police to this incident, up in the lift, into the room. There is a man standing in the corner, and it's the same guy that had scooped his dog up. And on the floor is his girlfriend with a pit bull, the same dog, clasped to her arm, and she'd lost about 2.5 pints of blood. So, you know, that's the kind of individual that was familiar to David when he's talking about this scenario here. So what did the police do about it? Well, following the death in April of 2009, one of the things they did was they set up Operation Navarra. This was a police raid, a series of police raids. So they raided 12 homes using 60 officers, and they seized 20 dogs, targeting particularly gang members. And of course, they used these stun shields for the first time. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to find out if any of these guys had a serious criminal offending history, or are they just guys that happen to have dogs? Yeah. So this is what I found. On the left-hand side, you have a whole series of different criminal activities, and on the right-hand side, you've got 8 different addresses with occupants. Now, the ethnicity here is all African Caribbean because this is Lambeth, and it's a very kind of mixed area. But if this series of raids had been done in Glasgow or in Liverpool, you would probably find this was all white. So you don't read anything too much into the ethnicity angle. But what you can read into is some of the huge volume of offences that some of these guys have been involved in. Theft from person seems to be very popular, so that's kind of robbery. Assaults, breach of bail order, possession of cannabis and drugs, again quite high, possession of cannabis. This guy, 4 counts. So, you know, some of them have got pretty heavy offending histories. So, you know, these are not people that we're going to be seeing next door with their Dalmatians. You know, these guys are into something really quite different. So here we get to the meat and potatoes. I wanted to find out what motivates people to have these kind of dogs and use them in this particular way. So I found that what lay behind this was a number of key things. First of all, there were a number of cultural issues that lay behind this. I'll talk about those in a minute. But importantly was this kind of concept that dogs are no longer being seen the way they were. Dogs are no longer being seen as family members. When I grew up, the dog had a name, it was part of the family, it slept on the couch, slept in the bed. It was very much part of the family. For many people now, that has gone. The dog is now seen as a commodity. So it's not part of the family. It's not thought to be a sentient being with feelings. It's thought to be a bit like a mobile phone, something you can trade up or trade down. If it's not aggressive enough, get rid of it, tie it to a park bench, get another one the next day off the internet. It becomes a commodity. So what can this dog do for me? How much can it make for me? How much status and kudos will it bring to me? And then the other thing I found was this idea of breed symbolism. That's where particular types of breed have a reputation or create a kind of symbolic status, if you like. And that became very important. And in a sense, breeds have a certain brand. They have a brand value. And for young men in particular, that can be very, very important. Now, I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. But I found 4 key motivations: fashion, protection, entrepreneurship, which is basically making money, and then image and identity. So I'll go through each one for you now. Oh yeah, sorry, there we go. Commodification. So the brand values of the dog are being actively sought. Okay? Actively sought. So these brand values, in relation to, say, pit bulls, use that as one example, are that, well, they have a pariah social status. They have a particular reputation, possibly for violence or aggression. They can be very malleable, which means you can do anything with them. You can make them what you want. If you want to make it aggressive, you can make it aggressive. If you want to make it pliable and compliant, it can be. But pit bulls, for example, are also thought to have fierce loyalty, high pain thresholds, and some of the kids refer to them as ultimate warriors. I did a focus group, Britain's first ever focus group, with young dog fighters, 4 Asian boys, all aged 16, 17, and they were all dog fighters. And their knowledge about dogs was indescribable. It was like interviewing 4 12-year-old boys about Top Gear and their knowledge of cars. They were able to tell you everything about those particular dogs. How much they weighed, how much they ate, how much exercise they needed, whether that dog could fight that dog and win. Their knowledge of dogs was absolutely astonishing to me. But many of these things, like this lockjaw thing, you know, relate to a number of myths that the kids have in their heads, and they'll talk about all of these things very actively. And a lot of these young men are thrilled at the idea that you can cross a bull mastiff with a Rhodesian Ridgeback and get something that will tear the head off that dog. And you know, they talk about it very, very excitedly like this. So here's the first motivation. This was the least motivational issue of all. So these are people who are basically, they've got an aggressive bull breed dog because of fashion. And really, these are people who like to play outside the rules. This year, they've got a pit bull. Next year, they'll have an Alaskan Husky. The year after that, they'll have a pet snake. And then the year after that, it'll be an angelfish. You know, they're looking for the kind of weird and wonderful things. They're quite often anti-fashion people, and it's all kind of built into street culture. But what is interesting is that the canine attributes change for each one of these motivations. Sorry, can you see him? I'm blocking you. So here, the animal that they choose will signify a non-conformist lifestyle. So there are certain unique qualities, and in criminology terms, we call this kind of thing a passport to another life. So it's basically something to get people out of boredom. Okay, so fashion. The next one was protection. And I found that the women that I interviewed were quite often using bull breed dogs and pit bulls for protection. Also, in terms of the interviews, it tended to be the older, more mature men. So anyone who was above 35, 40 might have a pit bull for this type of thing. Okay? So these are people who have been victimised. They might live in council estates, social housing, where the threat of burglary is very high. They want something that will protect them. But the ability to generate fear is important. But it can lead to escalation in the neighbourhood. So I get one, you get one, you get one, you get one, yeah? And it becomes a neighbourhood escalation thing. But again, the attributes of the dog have changed. So here, it's much more related to the traditional role of pet guardian. It can generate instinctual fear, but you can also advertise the fact that you've got the dog to the neighbourhood. So that's slightly different. Okay. Now we go into the top 2 motivational categories. entrepreneurship, using the dog to make money. So the dog is used to make money in one of two ways, either through breeding or through using the dog as a heavy to collect drug debts and securities and money that's owed. Okay? So the dog provides a credible threat of violence. So you don't really need to get the dog to do anything, you just need to bring it. You bring the dog and you say, you owe me 500 quid for that bag of drugs you got last week. And the dog is there just kind of staring up. That alone is what we call a credible threat of violence. One of the most interesting things that happened to me during my research was I was in Brixton Market, very, very busy. And I'd gone there to see if I could do any interviews. And suddenly the entire crowd parted, and through the crowd came a young man of about 25, stripped to the waist, very muscular, with two pit bull dogs, probably the most exquisite looking pit bull dogs I'd ever seen. They were absolutely immaculate, but they were almost lion-like. They were so big and muscular. And he had chains on each one and bull harnesses with studs. And it was as if he was riding a chariot, and he moved through the crowd. Everybody parted, and this guy was obviously a real kingpin. And I made the terrible mistake of going up to him and asking him for an interview. And he told me where to go in no uncertain terms, I can tell you. But I then found a very safe vantage point from a car park, and I watched, and he was there to seal a drug deal, and he was Mr. Big, and he'd got out of a £40,000 Subaru car. I mean, it was very expensive, and he had his two minders behind him, and I don't know what he thought of me, this middle-aged Scottish man going up and asking for an interview. And anyway, he was there to seal a very, very important deal. But what was fascinating was his ability to control the public space around him just by having these two things. And he really, walked like this. It was quite incredible. That will stay with me for a very long time. So anyway, for guys who are involved in this kind of thing, it's very much about having the dogs out there for show and for, giving this sense that they can be used, and they will be used for violence. They will be used. So the canine attributes change again. Here it's very much about visual branding or using it as a commercial asset. And the breeding issue is enormous. I mean, I had no idea at all about hybridization and scatter breeding and backstreet breeding, but this is the demand and supply market that sits behind these status dogs. You can buy these dogs for £10, £20, £50 down the pub from some dodgy guy, or you can buy them off Gumtree, or you can buy them off the internet. They're all there, and it's very, very quick and easy. Nobody cares about the pedigree of the dog. Nobody cares about the bloodline, unless they're into breeding themselves, in which case the bloodline will become extremely important to them, and that is the absolute selling point. Now, I met one 16-year-old boy who made £7,000 just from selling one top quality dog, and then he and his uncle would breed these dogs, and they would, two litters of 15 each per year from a breeding pair of pit bulls, and he was making another £5,000 or £6,000. Now, if you're on benefits in a tower block in South London, that's a lot of money, yeah? So, and then, of course, the attributes may be enhanced to increase the market value. So here's the next thing. This is the one thing that I found that kind of played with my head a little bit, because I had always believed that it was deed, not breed. That was what I brought to this. I always thought that. But there was one thing I found that made me begin to think, well, is that always the case? And that was the fact that some of these guys who are involved in backstreet breeding are breeding the pit bulls, and I say pit bulls as a kind of shorthand term for meaning all kinds of aggressive bull breed dogs. So they were breeding them, and within a few months they would breed again. They would take the most aggressive ones and breed from them, and then take the most aggressive ones and breed from them. And it's a kind of stepped effect, a ratchet effect. And within 5 years, you're actually so far away from the original breeding pair. You've been breeding and breeding and breeding from the most aggressive ones. The runts and the benign ones are all, you just get shot of them. But you keep the ones that are most aggressive and display all those kind of aggressive traits. So within 5 years, half a dozen, 9 or 10 different breeding cycles, you're actually so far removed from the original collection that you've kind of bred violence into them in a way that I hadn't thought possible. Now, you are the experts in all of this, not me. I may have that completely wrong. But that was something that I noticed and was related to me on a number of occasions. And I thought that was a bit worrying. So just to move on, I'll speed up a bit. This was the big one, image and identity. Now, this is the real thing where young men are involved in trying to generate status amongst their peers. So the issues that are involved here are all kind of sociological concepts, issues of masculinity, social competition. These guys are all in competition with each other in their kind of immediate environment. Who's bigger, who's tougher, who's stronger, who can punch more, who sells the best drugs, who knows the most, who's got the most friends on Facebook, you know, all of that stuff. And body image and physicality becomes very, very important. Now, in the olden days, here we go, this is the sociology lecture. In the olden days, young working class men would either have an apprenticeship or they would be able to demonstrate their social worth quite easily. And that quite often meant that they would have to get into a fight to do it. They'd have to prove themselves in a fisticuffs fight. Those days have gone. Yeah? Now, you have to prove yourself in different ways. And one of the ways that you would prove yourself is basically by bringing along an absolutely massive dog, because that will generate the status for you. Suddenly all your friends are saying, well, what do you want to do this afternoon? You know, we can go down to the bus station and cause havoc, and you go, nah, the dog doesn't want to do that, mate. Yeah, the dog wants to do something else. We've got to do what the dog wants to do, yeah? So the dog becomes the center of attention. And because you're the handler of the dog, it gives you a status and a kudos that you probably never had before. So it puts you right up the rank very, very quickly. And then if the dog is pulled, as you were mentioning before, it becomes a situation where everybody gets to have a go of the dog, if you like, to be part of that ownership. So that can be very, very important. So here the canine attributes are, it's all about masculinity, it's about becoming an alpha male. How do you become an alpha male? How do you show that you've got superiority over your friendship group? It's about amplifying your image. It's about advancing your status amongst your friends.